Good afternoon, everybody. We all know that artificial intelligence and machine learning is a fast evolving field, and as the power and intelligence of the man-made machine is increasing, these are leading to violation of human rights. We are thus here to discuss all these issues in this panel discussion. The speakers of the panel discussion are Professor Machiko. Dr. Machiko is an assistant professor of public international law at Utrecht University, Netherlands. He is also a member of the management board of Utrecht Center for Regulation and Enforcement in Europe and serves as an editorial board member of the Leiden Journal of International Law, along with her many other responsibilities. Dr. Machiko has received her PhD from Kyoto University, LLM at London School of Economics, and MA in Law from the University of Sheffield. Our host speaker is Dr. Jyoti Ahluwalia, Associate Professor of Data Analytics, Machine Learning, and Artificial Intelligence at Sushant School of Business, Sushant University. Now I hand over the panel discussion to Dr. Jyoti.
Thank you, Dr. Deepak, for such a nice introduction. And we are honored to be part of this panel discussion today. And I thank Sushant University School of Law and School of Business for organizing this. I also take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Machiko, who's joining us from Netherlands. Welcome, Dr. Machiko, to our university and to our panel discussion today. We are fortunate to have you today with us. We know that AI is now a part of our lives, and it has permeated our lives in such a way that none of us is not getting affected by it. We have examples all around of how it is affecting our lives. So whether it is in healthcare, where doctors are making predictions using AI, or it is in the form of self-driving cars, or it is in the form of insurance, where insurance companies are making predictions whether they should allow me to have the policy or at what premium should I be given the policy, or judges, especially in countries like US, where they're using AI systems to make predictions about judiciary decisions, or is it in employment, where HR personnel are using AI techniques to predict who should be employed, who should not be employed, who should be given a promotion. So we see that AI is part of our lives now. And also we see that on social media, on Facebook, all our data is getting shared. We are constantly in touch. We are constantly being profiled. So since AI is now a part of our lives, we have to discuss how it affects our lives. And are there any negative impacts that AI is bringing to our lives? And that is why we've organized this AI and human rights discussion today. Like I mentioned, we are happy to have Dr. Machiko with us today. So Dr. Machiko, I would like to start the discussion by asking you, what do you think is the impact of AI on human rights? And why should we be discussing it today in today's era? And what future do you think holds for us in terms of impact of AI on human rights?
Well, thanks a lot, first of all, Dr. Deepak and Dr. Jyoti. I'm very happy to be here. And as everyone knows, today's topic is a broad issue, and no one can assess all the different aspects involved in AI and human rights. So this topic has to be approached from interdisciplinary perspectives. So in that sense, I'm very excited to share the panel with Dr. Jyoti, and I'm a legal scholar, an international legal scholar, and I look forward to having a dialogue and discussions on this multifaceted issue. So change the slide or?
Right.
Okay, yeah. Good. So yeah, AI is already becoming a common household term. Maybe you have had a discussion with your sisters, brothers, parents, grandparents, perhaps. And we all, perhaps, we all have heard of various controversies involving big techs, 4 big techs or 5 big techs, depending on how you categorize them, namely Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft. All the controversies regarding these big techs are everywhere, and we all must have read certain types of articles and controversies regarding the use of our data and analysis and the impact that these companies have caused on our daily lives. And it is safe to say, as Dr. Jyoti pointed out, that we are all being tracked and profiled by different types of digital technologies that have commercial or regulatory relevance. And, just a reminder, every single like button tells you something about your personality and your behaviors. So your digital footprint would allow companies as well as public bodies to infer what kind of products you may wish to buy or what are the risks that you might have in terms from the perspective of public bodies or what kind of services you may wish to use. So, and these type of techniques to predict your behavior have been used by both private companies as well as political parties and public bodies. So we all have heard of different controversies involving big techs, but I wanted to give you 2 examples outside those big tech examples that we are all familiar with. So one of the examples I wanted to mention was the scandal. I'm from Japan. I live in the Netherlands already for some time, but I'm from Japan. And the example I would like to mention is a scandal involving one of the recruiting platforms in Japan. It's called Rikunabi. So in Japan, Rikunabi is a very familiar term. Rikunabi is one of the largest job hunting websites in Japan. If you are a new graduate, if you are graduating from the university in Japan, this is one of the websites that everyone would have to register and use in order to find vacancies and apply for the companies. So what this recruiting service has done several years ago was to create a score indicating how likely the student looking for a job decline an offer from the company. So this recruiting service company obtained information from its clients, namely the companies that are trying to hire students, and matched personal data that this recruiting service company has. And then they created a score for individual candidates, and they saw the likelihood that those candidates decline an offer to the companies that are actually recruiting those graduates. So the company said that it used the data of around 75,000 students or graduates who are looking for a job. So this handler has created a lot of controversies and actually led to some changes in Japan's privacy law. But this is just one of the examples that illustrates your behavior has been profiled and monitored by some of the private companies in such a manner that their indication affect the chances that you get an offer from the companies. So this is one of the many scandals in Japan, but the second example I wanted to share with you was the example in the Netherlands where I live at the moment. So as the example in Japan I talked about was example involving private companies in Japan. But the example in the Netherlands I want to talk about is the one involving public bodies, public authorities. So one of the huge controversies in the Netherlands over the last a few years ago is the use of risk indication system called Siri. So maybe some of you might have heard of it, but Siri is a system that calculates the risks, especially for the risks for social security fraud. So this system allows public authorities to know how likely you are going to commit a social security fraud, social welfare. And since 2014, the system Siri has been developed, deployed by some local government agencies in order to detect social security fraud. An initial idea was that by using this system, local authorities can save money because they can easily detect who is going to commit social security fraud, therefore minimize administrative burdens. But this system was developed especially at low-income neighborhood in some cities in the Netherlands. And once those citizens are flagged based on this AI-generated risk indication system, they were subject to extra scrutiny by local authorities. So luckily, this became the use of such data and AI-driven identification of your fraudulent risks became politically controversial. And in February 2020, the Hague District Court, one of the courts in The Hague in the Netherlands, ordered to stop the use of Siri on the ground that this violates the right to privacy under the European Convention on Human Rights. So these are just one of the many examples, but these examples illustrate the fact that we are all being monitored, tracked, and profiled, and then AI-generated prediction of your behavior really affect your future. So I understand that Dr. Jyoti would talk about the concept of AI. What is AI? We are talking about them.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Machiko. These were very relevant examples. And we see these examples not just in European countries, but also I keep reading about such examples in US, where judiciary and social security systems are using systems to make predictions about convicts, how probable they are to make mistakes in the futures, and how many hours of social security assistance should be given to people who need assistance. And there have been court cases related to that when people are not happy with the kind of hours of help that they were previously getting and the hours of help they got after such systems were implemented. So you are so right with these examples that such impact on human rights and impact on our lives is happening by the predictions made by AI. So just to put things into context, let's just understand what AI means. When we say the term AI, what comes to our minds and what implications should we understand from it? So AI is a very broad umbrella term, and it is used for many of algorithmic applications, whether they are related to computer vision or robotics or related to gaming and music or medicine or fraud detection or natural language processing, which is when Siri understands or when we are able to convert text into computer understanding languages. So all these come under the application of AI. But AI is also, as we said, it is a very vast field. A lot of AI currently is speculative in the sense that a lot of systems of AI cannot be implemented, they are fiction, but a lot of these systems have been implemented. And what has been implemented is by the use of machine learning. So machine learning is a part of AI which uses data and statistical techniques and algorithmic techniques to make predictions. Now, Now, in machine learning itself, very recently, in the last decade, less than a decade, we have a new system called deep learning, in which we have tried to replicate, because in artificial intelligence, what we are saying is that we want to make machines as intelligent as human beings. So that is why we call it artificial intelligence. Now, if we want to make machines intelligence, scientists and researchers thought, let's look at human mind and see how it functions. So our mind has neurons and they are connected. So it's a deep network of connection of neurons. So they wanted to replicate that using mathematical equations, and they put systems of artificial neurons together and created something called deep learning, and also called neural networks or deep learning. And if we see deep learning, it has some three types of layers. It has the input layer, it has some hidden layers in between, and then it has the output layer, which generates the prediction. So one of the reasons why AI and machine learning is getting complicated is because the hidden layers, the amount of computations that is done in the hidden layers is very, very complex, and it is not transparent. Here we see only 3 hidden layers, but in some of the more complicated algorithms, in which, for example, Siri is trying to understand our language processing, it is trying to understand what instruction I'm giving, and it's going back and finding out the answers to it. Or even for a Google search, if I type something in the search and Google searches billions of sites for me and brings back the result, there are deep neural networks that are making all the calculations, and they have more than 150 or 200 hidden layers that are working. Now, humanly, it is not possible to understand the computation that is happening there. And so these systems are not transparent. So whenever a prediction is made by a judge or in a judicial setup, or a healthcare doctor for his patients, or an insurance agent to give policy, or a self-driving car to make a turn, or a Facebook image recognition software to recognize my face and to profile me, a lot of these networks are using algorithms that are dependent on deep neural networks, and hence non-transparent and complex. So one of the reasons that AI is becoming scarce is because these neural networks make it a black box and not able to understand. So again, just to bring to the fore the definition of AI, the Council of Europe's website is trying to define. A lot of people have tried to define. We brought here only one of the definitions, and it says we picked up Europe's Council of Europe's definition, because Europe, as Dr. Machiko, you must be knowing that Europe is making lots of advances in how AI should be regulated. They are very conscious. They are making initiatives. And so we have this definition here, which says that AI is a set of sciences, stories, and techniques whose aim is to make a machine imitate the cognitive capabilities of a human being. Now, when an algorithm of machine learning or AI defeats a Go champion, Go is a game which is considered to be highly cognitive, and an AI system defeats a Go player, then we are celebrating the cognitive ability of a machine learning system. But whenever we are using that cognitive capability to make ethical statements, to use it in ethical settings, I think there we are faced with challenges. So, Dr. Machiko, I'd like to bring back to you the discussion again. And I'd like to ask you that given these non-transparent and complicated AI algorithms that we have, how do you think can AI-driven predictions be problematic to human rights? And also, what are some of the major challenges that we have for the protection of the rights to privacy And what are some of the major challenges for equality and non-discrimination? So these are three sets of questions. I'd like to hand over to you now to tell us about predictions that affect human rights, the privacy laws, and also about how these AI systems are challenging inequality and discrimination. Over to you, Dr. Machiko.
Thanks. Yeah, as Dr. Jyoti pointed out, there are a lot of discussions at the Council of Europe as well as European Union level. In fact, yesterday or a day before yesterday, there was a leaked document developed at the European Union level, and they are now trying to create a new regulation on AI. And this leaked document was so broad that Twitter was full of discussions, and so EU and Council of Europe are taking a lot of forward-looking steps to regulate AI technologies. And there are lots of critiques about the process of developing those initiatives, but it is true that a lot of things are really happening at the Council of Europe and European Union levels. So going back to the discussion point, so I think the first question was whether AI-driven prediction, how can that be problematic from human rights perspectives? So perhaps everyone knows some of the concrete examples, such as biases in policing or biases in hiring processes. But I think it's good to point out that Dr. Jyoti knows about this a lot more obviously than I do, but machine learning involves an automated process of identifying patterns, and such patterns are identified through past data, like previous data, and by definition, prediction may reproduce one's past behavior. So that's why prediction can be problematic, because human rights are not necessarily to preserve the status quo, but also should be the mechanisms to change the status quo. So by definition, by creating prediction based on the previous past data, you are somehow reinforcing what has happened in the past. So fundamentally, prediction based on past data might not serve as a force for social and institutional change, and this is one of the sort of fundamental problems in utilizing AI-driven prediction that has consequences of reinforcing the existing structure, which do have a lot of problems in protecting human rights. So this is not a specific example, but just to point out some of the fundamental problems. Dr. Jyoti, you want to add something on this? Or?
Right, absolutely, Dr. Machiko. I think you're absolutely right about data. So whenever we are making systems, so we have a slide here talking about the machine learning life cycle, in which first we define our project objectives, we acquire data, we model the data, we interpret and communicate the data, and then implement the model to make predictions. Now, whatever data that we are using in this system, if it is biased, then that bias is carried forward, because algorithm is only the steps. It's just like a mechanical process that is implemented by the machine learning life cycle. So if the data is biased, and a lot of we know that human history is full of biases. So if we do not correct the data at that stage, then the bias is carried forward. And not just carried forward, it is amplified, because these systems will be used everywhere, whether it is a judiciary or the HR systems like you mentioned. And also, the other problem with data is that it might not be representative. So, for example, I read this case study about an American black woman, and once they were doing face recognition, that was around 2 to 3 years back in 2017. If she would use a face recognition software in her college or in any company that she went to, the face recognition system was not able to recognize her face, because that machine learning algorithm that was implemented there had never seen the face, had never been given pictures of people similar to her color. And so it was discriminating, and she had to use her friends' help and their faces to open locks of rooms and get herself logged into systems. So unless the data is representative, it cannot be used to all. The same happens in case of diseases. So, for example, if the doctor is using a machine learning algorithm to make some prediction about some disease, then the data that has been used to train should be representative of the section of the people on which the prediction is being made. If that data, that population is not representing the person, then there will be a wrong prediction and the wrong medicine will be given. So you rightly said data has to be correct and data has to be unbiased. So one of the ways, in one of the discussions and argument points that are getting generated in our discussion on AI regulations and how it's impacting human rights, is that how do we make sure that the data we feed into the machine systems are unbiased, and how do we make sure that they are representative? So you are absolutely right, Dr. Machiko. We have another question for you here. So what do you think are the major challenges for the protection of rights to privacy as a part of human rights and AI discussion?
Yeah, indeed. So, I mean, I think, the life cycle that you have shown was quite helpful in order to understand different phases in which problematic biases or assumptions can be given. And all kinds of human rights are affected, but one of the perhaps most immediately affected human rights, if I may say so, is the right to privacy. And quite often people say that maybe right to privacy in this digital age is almost non-existent. And just as a reminder, I'm an international legal scholar, so the right to privacy is provided in major international legal instruments, and they are also customary international law. That means that all the states they do have the obligation to protect right to privacy. And this does not mean that they are directly effective at the domestic level. Each state has its own privacy regulation. So in principle, right to privacy should be one of the safeguards, but there are multiple obstacles and challenges, perhaps as many of you can easily imagine. And I think one of the fundamental problems is that our ability to detect possible or actual human rights violations, including the violation of right to privacy, has been undermined. So, for instance, in the example of Rikunabi, the Japanese recruiting platform where all the graduates would have to register, they are not aware of the fact that their past behavior, which website they clicked, which company they applied for, all kinds of digital footprints have actually been used in order to create indicators for their likelihood to accept or decline an offer. So if these kind of data collection as well as the analysis of the collected data has been done without our knowledge, and in the end, what those students might have seen on the website was simply that they didn't have any companies that give them an offer, without knowing the reasons why they didn't get, they got less offer than they would have expected. So privacy is obviously affected, but much more fundamental problem is that our ability to detect possible harms on our human rights has been significantly undermined. That's a huge problem without any immediate solutions, I have to say. So that's a bit of the fundamental problem. But there are much more sort of practical issues. For instance, just talking about this Japanese case of Rikunabi, a recruiting website that created AI-generated indicators for graduates. They, at least at the time before the recent amendment of Personal Privacy Act in Japan, for instance, cookies were not part of the personal information protected by the Japanese legislation that are meant to protect the citizens' privacy. So depending on how each state define the scope of personal information to be protected, some data that do have consequences in our life might not be covered by the right to privacy as interpreted by each government. So that's a bit of the second layer of problem, how each country define the personal data which should be protected. And finally, there's a problem of consent. We all tend to click, consent. Okay, do you give consent to cookies, or do you give consent to this conditions or to get access to a certain website? And I would assume that not everyone would be willing to read all these lengthy requirements that might cause some harm to your life at some point. So there is a privacy protection in many countries, and there is also international framework. But in many cases, consent already give approval to public authorities and private companies to gather data, as well as to analyze it and to infer some behavior patterns based on the analysis of the data. And this consent does not mean that we have actually understood what we are being consenting to. So that's another layer of problem. So just to map a few major spots.
All right, Dr. Pachiko, that was you're absolutely right. We are being constantly profiled, and without our knowledge, our data is being collected. Even in our phones that we are attached to all the time, that we are using all the time. There are so many sensors, there's so many algorithms, there's so many applications that are present on our phone that is collecting the data, and we are not aware of them. We wear Apple watches, we wear Fitbit watches, we drive cars which are connected all the time, and we are on internet, we are connected all the time, and all this data is being used by companies. In fact, if you see how these big tech companies like Google and Amazon, they have grown and they have been working, and Facebook, they've been working, is that they're using all our data, and the amount of capacity they have to generate research to use our data for algorithms is tremendous, and that is what is helping them grow. And it's the challenge of privacy in this digital and connected age is multifaceted. Like you mentioned, even if I give a consent, I'm not sure what I'm giving my consent to, because my data can be used in n number of ways. There's so many permutation and combinations that can be applied to the data that is generated by each person. And not just that, my life making decisions, my future decisions are going to be driven by that. So for example, even in, let's say a very, not a very high impact decision, like what movies do I watch? So if I have logged into Netflix, or I have logged into Amazon to buy something, and I buy a particular I see a particular movie, or I buy a particular product, then the recommendation engines suggest that you should buy the similar product, and this is what you can buy. Now that limits me. Suppose I have seen movies like drama movies or English dramas, period dramas, and I want to see some actions. Now I'm not recommended actions. So if I want to change my behavior in the future, then I'm driven by my past behavior. And like we said about prediction, the same is that you have collected data about me without my consent, without even the thought of how it can be used, and that is being used to profile me, to put me into buckets, and then to make suggestions on my lifestyle, which movies can I see. Not just that, even when I go to, a lot of companies are using financial data to predict whether I should be given a loan or not. So finance companies are not just using my financial data, but also my social data to predict. HR companies are using not just my formal records, but they're also using my social network profile to see if I should, and then use AI systems to predict whether I should be given a job or not. So these are many multifaceted, complex issues that I think our governments are facing. Like you mentioned, Europe is making efforts to make regulations on these levels, and the GDPR regulation last 2 years back was an effort in this regard. Some states in America are also making efforts, like the one of the example legislations is of the California state, which is making regulations on how to manage privacy issues. In India also, we have the government has come out with 2 draft regulations. One is related to non-personal data, and one is related to personal data. The government is trying to define what do I mean by non-personal data and what do I mean by personal data, and then to bring in regulations to manage the privacy issues on both the fronts. But both these draft regulations, the industry has also given their feedback on it, and both these draft regulations are pending in our parliament, and we hope to see laws related to them very soon. Just to bring another perspective, here it's not just people who are affected, it's also companies who are affected, because Facebook and Amazon, all these companies have so much data collected that the smaller players, the smaller corporates cannot compete with them because of this data issue. And these 2 laws that the Indian government is trying to bring, the non-personal data and the personal data, also tries to address the issue of bringing a level playing field between corporates who can then give services and have access to large amounts of data on the same level. Because these huge big tech companies have so much data, they have the networking effect, which means that once they go in the process of success, they are able to build more applications and then generate more data, and then based on that more data generate more applications and become bigger and become like mammoth machines that we see Facebook and Amazon to have become. And I think people are aware, the governments are aware, they're making efforts, but because it's so complicated, it's so widespread that they are being challenged of how to regulate it. Any more thoughts on it, Dr. Machiko?
I mean, as Dr. Jyoti said, the problems are extremely multifaceted and affect all aspects of our lives. In a way, talking about once again on the impact of AI generated prediction on our human rights, including the principle of non-discrimination or equality. Non-discrimination and equality is a very broad concept, and there are sub-categories or a set of sub-issues that are protected by this broad principle of human rights. but some of the most widely discussed issues are gender discrimination as well as racial discrimination, and there are abundant examples everywhere, and I'm sure all of you would be aware of some of the examples. For instance, talking about gender biased prediction, AI has been used in healthcare, and I have read that, for instance, the data usually built on men's data, and that might have some problems when the doctor use AI-based prediction in order to detect and diagnose a woman's heart diseases, for instance. So this has, if doctor is not aware of the potential biases in the data, as well as the outcomes of data-generated prediction, they might miss some of the symptoms that are common for women, but not necessarily existent for men. So that's one of the examples in a healthcare where gender biases might have fatal consequences. And talking about racial biases, there is a very good movie. It's called Coded Bias. Perhaps some of you might have watched it. It is about facial recognition, and it talks about a story of a researcher who discovered that some of the big tech's facial recognition technology has biases depending on your color of skin, of the color of your skin. So there are abundant examples, but the same problem persists when it comes to the effect on AI-generated prediction on equality and non-discrimination, namely our ability to detect some of the possible discriminatory outcomes. So that is something that we see not just for the right to privacy, but also the effect on non-discrimination and equality. And another related issue is that there are indeed frameworks that protect us from being discriminated. There is a framework at international level, regional level, national level to protect the principle of non-discrimination and equality. But at the same time, those frameworks or right to non-discrimination are interpreted usually on an intuitive basis or in a very contextual manner by judges or some of those people who are in a position to interpret those principles. So scholars such as Sander Wachter in Oxford, they argued that the current legal frameworks to protect to preserve non-discrimination or to protect equality would not be workable in the context of AI-generated process, because legal frameworks depend on contextual and intuitive interpretation by judges or those who are in a position to interpret those human rights principles. So there are some solutions. For instance, Dr. Jyoti mentioned a GDPR at a European level, but GDPR is one of the most robust frameworks to protect human rights, including right to privacy and right to personal data. But GDPR itself does not necessarily regulate how exactly our data is being evaluated. What if the methods of evaluation analysis are simply not good quality? How can we do about it? So that's not something that GDPR has dealt with so far. So I'm just sort of pointing out the problem without providing solutions.
Right, ma'am. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of challenges that the AI system is bringing to equality and discrimination. So we have examples where, for the same kind of small thefts, a black person is considered high risk than a low person, than a white person, and we have, right. I'm just yeah. So a black person is, so here we are discriminating, and also in terms of there are, like you mentioned, there are various examples of discrimination. Just to bring it into more perspective, for example, in a financial data. Now, when an algorithm is making a prediction whether to give a loan to a person or not, and previously more men have applied and more men have been given loan rather than women, because they have working, for example, in a country like India, more men work compared to women. So when data is used by a financial institutions to make prediction, the algorithm would say that if the gender is male, then the probability of providing the loan would be higher. Now, in such a case, then there is discrimination against the women. Now, in this example, if at the time of inputting the data in the machine learning algorithm, if we delete the gender feature, if we delete from the data whether the person is a male member or a female member, then maybe the discrimination is taken care of, and the algorithm is no longer basing its decision on the gender, because of not correcting the data at the initial stages, a lot of discrimination happens. And the thing about discrimination is that a lot of this discrimination is not visible upfront. We are not able to see that discrimination has happened, and the data is captured with that discrimination. So, like you said, you are pointing out a problem without a solution, because a lot of it is in undercurrents, and we are not able to identify that there is discrimination in the data unless it is highlighted by some case or by some issue. Like you mentioned, there are frameworks applicable, there are frameworks present both at the international level, at the national level, but these frameworks, like you mentioned, are very broad. When they're applied to make algorithms non-discriminatory, we have to highlight what is the action that we want to take. So, for example, in this example of financial data, maybe the coder or the company who's making the algorithm to predict whether the loan should be given to the person or not should be aware that the gender part should be taken away from the data. The data should be made non-gender. And you would be surprised to know that gender is a high quality feature. What I mean by high quality is that the prediction power, a feature like we are profiled, so all our features are getting put in the database. So if a feature has high probability, high prediction power, then it is called an important feature. So gender is an important feature for predicting. What I mean to say is that the prediction power of an algorithm is increased if I put gender there, if I put ethnicities there, if I put class there. So we have to, again, giving an example of class, maybe no longer in our country, but in countries like Brazil and Colombia, there are some families who are very, very rich, and their surnames, the surname of the family makes a huge impact on the prediction power of the algorithm. So these, even if they are high weightage features, they have a high impact on the prediction power of the algorithm, they should be taken away from the data. So one ground level impact or the ground level work that can be done is by the company, or is by the coders, is by the algorithm makers, to make sure that the data that they are inputting is correct, is not biased, and that requires a lot of work. And so regulations and guidelines have to be put in place to make sure that these are implemented. So, Dr. Machiko, what any more thoughts on any more aspects that you think we can discuss about human rights and AI?
Yeah, I mean, sort of perhaps finally, I think it's good to remember that, as Dr. Jyoti pointed out, biases can happen in multiple phases of data collection, data analysis, and the deployment of the analyzed data. So I think there was a slide with a bit of time frame or timeline of the analysis. So, for instance, Dr. Jyoti talked about biases in the collection of data and analysis processes, but the deployment, the use of analyzed data or predicted indication of the behavior can also be biased. That is pretty much embedded in human biases. For instance, in the example in the Netherlands I mentioned at the beginning, namely the use of a risk indication system called Siri. So the system that calculate how likely you're going to commit social security fraud. So that system was deployed not necessarily to general population, but some local authorities, specifically to monitor some of the low-income neighborhood, based on the assumption that people in low-income neighborhood would be more likely to commit social security fraud. So,
right.
There are different stages of bias, not just in terms of the collection of data, but also how exactly AI-generated indication should be used.
Yeah, I agree, Dr. Machiko. It's a very good example you've pointed out, that it's not just the data that is biased, but also the assumption of the people who have devised that algorithm system that low-income people will have more probability of frauding the system. So that's what maybe we can point out, that algorithm is just steps of mathematical steps that the machine is following. And it's the human intervention that is more important, both at the time of making the system, at the time of collecting the data, at the time of making assumptions, what should go into the data and the algorithm, and also at the time of interpreting. So in my opinion, even if a judge is using, or an HR person is using, or an insurance company is using, or police is using for profiling convicts, all these can use AI as an augmented feature to help them do better service. But at the final stage, it should be the judge or the police who should take action, who should be the decision maker, and they should be accountable for their decision. Just like in self-driving car, I think except maybe Germany, none of the countries are saying that the machine is responsible. It is the person sitting in the car that will be held, even if it is a self-driven car. So I think we can use AI, which is very, very powerful, has high cognitive ability, but we can use it for helping us to make a decision, but the final decision should be of the person in charge, whether it's a judge or a police or a doctor or an employer. So I would like to say that the possible actions that we can take is maybe when we are coding. So some people have suggested that there should be an encoding movement about who code matters, what we code matters, and why we code matters, and how we code matters. And then we can also build platforms that can collect people's experiences about algorithmic bias. Like we mentioned, the data has bias, but we are not able to understand that bias unless some case happens, somebody is affected and they call out for help. And so we can, our discussion today, we can collect examples of what biases have happened and then go back and correct our systems. And then we can have audit existing softwares, audits, the whole process. We can build up an audit exercise where legislation would help, where broad legal guidelines would help. And we should have more inclusive training data sets. By this I mean that whenever an algorithm is run, first it is trained. We know that machine learning algorithms are trained, and they're trained on some data sets. So in our example of the black female in 2017, when the image recognitions systems were not able to recognize her face, was that because the data on which the machine learning algorithm was trained did not include black people. And so we need to create more inclusive training data sets that are more representative of the data of the population that on which the algorithm will be used to make predictions. And broadly, we can start thinking more consciously about the social impact of the technology we are developing. So I think our today's discussion on AI and human rights and its impact on human rights is very, very apt in today's circumstances. And the very fact that we are becoming more aware that something needs to be done, we are becoming more aware that there is a dialogue happening between citizens, and governments, between organizations, and we are making an effort to understand how AI is impacting our lives and to make corrective actions and put in place policy and frameworks. I think it's a very, very positive steps. We are proud that we have reached so far in terms of development of machine learning systems, but we have to be careful as humanity that we do not use it for destruction. It's a technology that we should use for progression. It's an absolutely fantastic technology, and we should take it forward to advance humanity and advance progress for all of us. I would like Dr. Machiko for you to contribute to the final concluding thoughts.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Doshi. I mean, I fully agree with all these possible actions, and they are all necessary. But we talked about some of the impact on human rights, and one of the fundamental problems was, as I mentioned a few times, our ability to detect. So in that regard, there are some proposals suggested by scholars such as Sandra Bachter. So for instance, she suggests that we should use statistics-based test, more specifically demographic disparity. If AI-driven prediction do not match with the demographic disparity, we should at least start critically scrutinizing the AI machine learning processes. So there are some solutions, and I hope those solutions will be part of the legislative process in various parts of the world. So that's one of the things I wanted to mention. And the final thing I need to mention is the development at the European Union level. As I mentioned a few days ago, there was a leaked document on the regulation of artificial intelligence at the European Union level. So this is still a draft, so we don't know what the ultimate outcome would be. But this EU's regulation seems to be applicable to entities outside the European Union, as long as their AI system affects persons within the European Union. So the same extraterritorial effect beyond the boundary of European Union that we have seen from the GDPR might be happening from the European Union, including the companies in India.
Right, you're absolutely right. And Europe has always been at the forefront of bringing in more advanced and better legislations in all aspects, and making progress there. So, like GDPR, and I hope our government also passes the laws on the non-personal data and the personal data legislations that we have as draft regulations. So we see that people are conscious and more developments are happening on these fronts. So I think we can open the discussion for open the channel for discussion. Over to you, Dr. Deepak, if any students or anybody has questions that Dr. Machiko can address.
One question One question from Shashigopal Menon. That question, will human rights survive in the future, or will machine rights equal or take over human rights? With artificial intelligence poised to grow exponentially and eventually overshadowing human intelligence, how will we ensure human rights?
Dr. Machiko, would you like to take up the question?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I mean, I can only hope that human rights would continue to be relevant. But as I said, indeed, there are fundamental challenges. We are coded and profiled on a daily basis or minute by minute basis, and every single footprint that we drop really shape our future without really involving, without our awareness. So some of the solutions would have to be part of the legislative discussions at the legislative bodies in all the countries, because nowhere is safe with the effect of AI. So one of those solutions is the use of a bit of statistics-based tests in order to detect the possible biases embedded in the data or analysis of data or the use of those data. So those are the things that we see in some parts of the world, but not necessarily everywhere. So that's one of the things. And the definition of privacy should be as wide as possible, not just the personal data in traditional sense, but also cookies, as well as some of the information inferred based on analysis of our data. So yeah, those small steps that we can take.
Another question, Professor, from Mr. Satyamurthy Ramsundar. While there are privacy concerns, yes, Professor?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
While there are privacy concerns with artificial intelligence, IoT and machine learning, these technology advancements have changed the quality of life completely. In fact, data science drives most consumer-facing businesses today through their predictive consumer trends. How do we balance these contradictions?
Maybe Dr. Jyoti wants to jump in here, or
yeah, all right, like I mentioned, these are huge advances for humankind, and there are benefits to it. Of course, we've been going forward with research in these areas, and big companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon have made such huge progress. And like as a data science student and researcher, I would like to tell you that in the last 2 years, there have been such tremendous researches and such tremendous innovations that have happened that are going to make things a lot easier for us to do in so many aspects of our life. One of the examples that very close to us is the Google search. The improvements in Google search over the last 20 years have been tremendous. They have made huge progress in the impact of deep learning, the kind of applications that deep learning can solve, the kind of complicated issues it can tackle, the image recognition, the natural language processing that has happened is tremendous. So, and that is why it is very, very important that due to some ethical issues and their their negative impacts, we do not get affected. And that is why discussions like these are important, that we should be able to utilize the positive impacts of AI like any other technology. Each technology will come with, will bring with it the negative impact. Even for a knife, a knife can be used for, cutting a cake, and it can be used for killing someone. So it's not the technology, but it is a test for human beings that we are able to use that technology to our benefit and not for our downfall. And the issue here is that the technology is very, very powerful. It is because we've made so much progress, we have a very, very powerful technology. And another issue is that it is, like I showed in the slide on deep neural network, that a lot of this is not transparent. We are not able to figure out in a lot of complicated algorithm that what is happening inside the algorithm to give us the prediction. What is the equation that is coming, mathematical equation that is happening there. All AI is based on mathematics. Behind the curtain, there are the numbers that are impacting the decision. So we are not able to figure out how those numbers are getting calculated. Nobody can, because of the layers of calculations that are happening. So this is a challenge because of its amplifying ability, because of its complicated ability. But at the same time, it's able to solve complicated problems. So we have, as humanity, we'll have to rise up to the occasion and see that it is used only for betterment of life. Like you mentioned, the corporates, all the progress in the corporate sector, a lot of progress is now dependent on machine learning. So we should take that progress forward. And just like, after Second World War, we did not use nuclear weapons. Again, nuclear weapon is a huge innovation that had happened, but it was a destructive innovation. So we should not let this innovation that has happened to us to lead us to destruction. And that's why we should study their impacts on human rights. We should study the negative impacts and put in place checks and balances that only promote the positive aspects of its impact. I hope that it was helpful.
Yeah, and I agree with Dr. Jyoti. I mean, there is no doubt that data science and computer science have helped us advance our life significantly. But I think what are the benefits and what are the risks? This course itself is shaped by powerful companies and some of the governments that want to support those companies. So I think we also need to be critical about our assumption about what are the benefits, what are the risks. Perhaps risks are significantly hidden. Maybe some of the potential benefits are significantly hidden. We don't know it. But I think it's good to be critical of the narrative itself. Some of our comfortable life might come at the expense of some of the human rights that we have built. So just to add. Over to you, Dr. Deepak.
Professor, one more question from Dr. Astha Mehta. Would it be feasible to confer legal personhood to artificial intelligence? What would be the concerns? What about the liability which arises? Which persons to be made liable, the programmer or the end user? Recently, we gave one example. Recently, in March 2019, Uber was not held criminally liable for one of the accidents by a self-driven car for the death of Elaine Herjberg in Arizona. It still remains undecided whether Uber's backup driver could face criminal charges.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not the expert on liability. I am aware that there has been a lot of discussions. What if a self-driving car has an accident and causes some fatal damage to a property or somebody's lives? And is it the responsibility of the company that provided this self-driving car, or is it the responsibility of those companies that provided underlying the data and technologies? Or is it the responsibility of nobody? So I understand that law is still underdeveloped. US might be heading to it, but I'm afraid I'm not the expert on the distribution of
Professor,
liability.
Technology come first, law come later. So after technology, we enact laws.
Right. I think I agree with you, Dr. Machiko, that there's not much laws. The laws is in the progress. Countries are thinking of what to do. And one of the reasons why we don't see so many self-driven cars on the roads in India or any other country is that law is not clear how to operate them and who will be held responsible. Otherwise, we would have seen more cars on the roads. So it's still in work in progress. Maybe in future we'll see some thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, the same distribution of liability has been discussed not just in the context of self-driving car, but also in healthcare. What if this AI-driven diagnostic turn out to be wrong? Whose responsibility is that? Or in the context of warfare, if some of the killer robot, that's some of the things that we hear from the news. But AI-assisted drone technologies or some of the weapons assisted by AI technologies, what if they made a mistake and killed innocent civilians? Whose responsibility are we talking about? So not just about self-driving car, but this allocation of liability has been discussed in many different contexts, and we only need legislative steps to clarify this.
Any other questions from attendees? I think Professor attendees does not have the question.
I think we can close the session.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much, Professor Machiko, for spare time for this fruitful discussion. And thank you, Professor Jyoti, for this, for sparing time and for hosting this discussion. Thank you very much, Professor Machiko and Professor Jyoti.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to be part of this discussion. And thank you, Dr. Machiko. It was an interesting and enjoyable discussion that we had. And for you to join us from Netherlands, thank you so much for giving us your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. And thank you for the participants for being with us.
Right. Thank you, participants, for listening to us. And thank you, Shashank University, and thank you, Dr. Deepak, for arranging all the things. I also want to thank the IT team for helping us all along to get this seminar rolling and making it successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.